Last evening I argued that our culture and a culturally captive church has abandoned a high view of what music is and how music's nature and power are somehow rooted in the nature of creation. I wanted to underscore that somehow because the history that we're going to look at in this lecture, people are trying to figure out how that's true, but there have been many efforts at theorizing how it's true. That it's true, people have not disagreed on. The first talk today, Culture, Nature, and History, will look at some of the history of that understanding, which has changed only relatively recently in the West, both inside and outside of the church. And before we look at that history, I want to say part of what I hope to be doing in these talks is to encourage you as a community and as families and as individuals to acquire the listening and verbal skills to have better conversations about music. Conversations that are more than the kind of Facebook binary like or dislike. I've thought, there should be an option to check loathe, am moderately intrigued by, find quizzical. There ought to be lots of options other than like or dislike, and we tend to approach music in a binary way. One of the wisest things Jeremy Begbie does in his book, Resounding Truth, is say, the first question people often ask him is, well, what kind of music do you like? And he said, in a sense, that's irrelevant. Until we have some understanding of what it is that I like, what I like is not that important. And so I'd like to encourage conversations, and I'd like to encourage you to at least aspire to conversations in which you can talk about an objective quality or attribute in music that could persuade others to regard it as more admirable or more deplorable than they previously thought. I want to encourage you to grow in your ability to speak and to listen in such conversations. And encourage you to increase your range of aesthetic experience, to increase the range of aesthetic delights. Is that so bad? Developing a richer range of aesthetic pleasure enhances our perception of the goodness of creation and the generosity of our Creator. Let me illustrate this with another psalm from Psalm 104, one of my favorite psalms about the givenness of creation, which begins, "Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent." Then it goes to a third person. "He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved." Now the psalm goes on for a number of verses praising God for his work of creation. And he set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. There's my givenness there. He orders reality. It goes on praising God for his work of creation, and then in verses 14 and 15, it takes an interesting little turn. Back to this second person address, "You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart." So here, the psalmist takes a little pivot and is thanking God, praising God, because creation that he has made has within it latent possibilities for joyous experiences. God is not the direct creator of wine or oil or bread, but he does make such creative cultural products possible, both in the inherent properties of the raw materials that we use and the agricultural procedures and then the preparation procedures, and also in our desire. When God's commandments are compared to honey, it's not just that honey is sweet, but we're created as beings who delight in sweetness. So there's a congruence between our nature and the potential joys that are present in creation. So wine and oil and bread and the experiences and the delights that they make possible are occasions for gratitude to the Creator. The production of good bread and good wine honors the goodness of creation more fully than does the production of mediocre bread and wine. If all we knew in the bread and wine department was Wonder Bread and Thunderbird, our hearts would not be quite as gladdened or our hearts be quite as strong. And if you don't know what Thunderbird is, you can go to Wikipedia. It's the beverage preferred by winos the world over. A really frightening fortified wine, which may in fact include parts of antifreeze. If that's all we knew about wine, this psalm would be a little perplexing. I also was thinking, the psalmist says our hearts gladdened and our hearts strengthened. I think the gladdening of the heart we understand. In fact, this may, I'm told in the Hebrew, refer to a kind of slight tipsiness, that the wine is gladdening the hearts of men. I have no idea if that's true. But to strengthen our hearts, I think that suggests the kind of confidence that we receive. The confidence that we receive in God's identity as creator because of the wonderful good blessing and generosity that we perceive. Now, sometimes I've heard it said, and much more often have heard it implied from people, well-meaning people, that music should just come from the heart. Since we're talking about hearts, it should just come from the heart, rather assumed than from the head. It should just come from the heart. It should just flow out of our natural feelings. And many Christians would argue, following certain dictates of 19th century Romanticism, that musical experience should be natural. It should be untrained. It should be sincere, uncultivated. And the key word that's often used in these settings is authentic. It should be authentic. Well, authentic what is the question that we need to ask. I'm intrigued by this use of authenticity. Sometimes if it means untrained, unschooled, instinctual, then to be an authentic human, to make authentic music is to be bestial in some way. And part of the delights of being a human being is that we are trainable, we are educable, we can learn things. So, but it's often objected, well, music that requires any kind of deliberateness or discipline, training, or cultivation to either listen to or to perform is artificial. Well, yes, it is. It's an artifice. Like wine is an artifice. It's something that is artfully crafted. It's constructed. But somehow that's regarded as not as spiritual as music that just oozes, that we simply secrete somehow. That would be a superior form of music. Well, that is like saying that grapes are more sincere pleasure than wine. And wild grapes, not those actually cultivated artificially in a vineyard. Or that raw grasses are more authentic than a good loaf of rye bread. Or that freshly picked olives are better than a rich olive oil. Has anyone ever seen or tasted a freshly picked olive? I have no idea what it would be like. In fact, one of the mysteries of Western civilization is, if it happened in the West, was the fact that somebody figured out what you could do with an olive. Wasn't that wonderful that we have this great experience? The gift that music is not recognized by reducing it to raw personal expression any more than the gift that grapes are could be honored by a teetotaler. Now, when I realized this analogy, I thought, this is good. I'm putting my opponents, aligning them with prohibition. So that that puts me in a nice position. I like that. The elements of the Lord's Supper, bread and wine, that have so been cultivated, are the products of acts of refinement and cultivation. And God's grace is somehow given to us by the means of the products of these acts of cultivation and refinement. So I think we should resist very strongly any kind of Gnostic tendency to extol immediacy as an aesthetic virtue. Some people similarly are nervous about the idea of aesthetic discernment because they think it smacks of elitism. To suggest that a greater level of musical competence could improve our making and hearing of music, these people say, that invites arrogance. Well, it's certainly true that people with a great level of achievement in any discipline run the risk of arrogance in any aspect of human life. It's interesting, we're not as worried about superior achievement in sports leading to arrogance, perhaps because all athletes demonstrate such impeccable modesty. We're worried about making our kids study Baroque violin because that will make them elitist and arrogant, and so we'll let them join a heavy metal band, and those people never seem to be arrogant or proud. Arrogance is found in any area of human achievement. There are mothers who are proud of how well they've raised their children, but that doesn't deter us from encouraging women to be better mothers. There are, I'm sure, preachers who count themselves among the few and the proud at the top of their vocation, and that's a bad thing, but we don't regard it as a reason to abandon the pursuit of homiletical excellence. The fear of elitism in the arts and in music particularly, I think, expresses an unspoken assumption that there really are no objective standards for assessing achievement regarding aesthetic matters, and so that anyone claiming to have superior knowledge or claiming to be able to lead others to superior knowledge must be doing so merely out of a desire to think of themselves more highly than they ought. That's the only possible explanation. There's no objective thing there. And I don't know that I've ever known anyone who really does believe that aesthetic judgments are rooted in objective standards, who thought that the danger of elitism was a sufficient reason to abandon the effort of making such judgments. Now, one could argue, well, they started out as elitists, and the only reason they think they are objective standards is because they're elitists. Well, there's a kind of circularity there. So we'll have to try to establish the objectivity of these standards. Part of what I tried to do in this lecture and the last one is to point out that throughout Western history, and certainly throughout all Christian history, it was assumed that there were objective standards. Growing in aesthetic discernment does involve us in becoming more discriminating, and that's kind of a no-no in a multicultural, diversity-celebrating culture. But it's odd for me to see people who are social political conservatives and theological conservatives siding with the advocates of unrestricted diversity. Discernment in the arts requires the recognition of when something doesn't quite measure up to what it's trying to do or to what it should do. In his book on the virtues, Romano Guardini writes, "I once asked a friend what culture really is, and he answered, 'Culture is the ability to judge.'" I was talking to Peter last night. I said, somebody asked me what culture is. I said, a culture is something that can make you feel guilty about something, and that it does impose a sense of obligation. But Guardini's friend says culture is the ability to judge, for in order to judge we must have standards, which have become a vital part of our feelings. Standards for great and small, genuine and false, noble and base. The standards are objective, but they become subjective. That is, they become part of our subjective life. They're rooted in reality, but we love them just as we love the law of God. We love the moral order that we're striving to be people who love the law of God. So growing in aesthetic discernment involves cultivating the ability to recognize the differences between great and small, between genuine and false, between noble and base, not just between good or bad. Some people, again, they put it in binary. Well, is this music good music or bad music? Is it beautiful or ugly? Well, there's a sliding scale. So we could say that music is banal or music is trite, or music is eminently forgettable. And there's some music that sticks in your head. I think Dave Barry has a book where he talks about how bad music, really bad songs, kind of stick in your head for some reason. Even if you know how bad they are, they kind of stick there. They get lodged there. But growing in aesthetic discernment involves cultivating the ability to recognize these differences, which means developing a bigger and a better vocabulary for talking about such things, which is why I want to encourage conversation, learning to name things more precisely and more deliberately. And for that, we're often assisted by listening to how voices from the past have spoken about music, which is a major feature of this talk. Our conversations about music should take account of what has been said about music by those who are not our contemporaries. C.S. Lewis was persistent in reminding his readers that they needed to correct the blind spots of their own age by knowledge of the past. In his essay on reading old books, he said, "Every age has its own outlook. It is especially good at seeing certain truths and especially liable to make certain mistakes. We all therefore need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period." And that means the old books. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get at them. Now, I would add that we need old books about music, and we need old music, because the beliefs about music and its place in creation of people who are now dead are most evident in their music and not just in their theorizing, which is why, as I was planning these lectures, I just wanted to keep just playing a lot of tunes for you, but alas, we don't have time to do that. And what we find if we read the old books about music is that for about 2,200 years, give or take a little, it was almost unanimously assumed in the West that music was a means of understanding something about the world as it really is, and for Christians, music was a means of understanding something about God as he really is. Today, we typically think that music is something that expresses our personal experience, and that musical tastes are entirely subjective and just a matter of personal preference. In fact, the phrase musical preference has a parallel with the phrase of sexual preference in our culture. And people defend their musical preference the same way some people defend their sexual preferences. And I want to suggest that both are confused uses of that idea of preference. And this is a completely novel assumption, both about sexuality and about music. It's one that I think undermines the fulfillment of music's potentials, and it really confirms the egocentric narcissism that's nurtured by modernity. Now, composer and critic Julian Johnson insists that to an earlier age, our contemporary idea of a complete relativism in musical judgment would have seemed nonsensical. One could no more make valid individual judgments about music than about science. Music was no more a matter of taste than was the orbit of the planets or the physiology of the human body. From Plato, who died around 348 BC, to Helmholtz, and here he means a scholar named Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a physicist and physician who developed theories of acoustics and aesthetics, who died in 1894. So he's saying from the mid-4th century BC until the late 19th century, music was understood to be based on natural laws, and its value was derived from its capacity to frame and elaborate those laws in musical form. Music's success was no more a matter of subjective judgment than the laws themselves. This is from Julian Johnson's book, Who Needs Classical Music? Music was assumed to be related somehow to the shape of the cosmos. And it was assumed that the order inherent in creation could be represented in musical form. Moreover, it was assumed that music could shape the inner life of men and women so that they could become in tune with the world. Or if it was discordant music, they would go out of tune with reality. And that belief is reflected still in our language when we say that someone loses their temper. Temper, who knows what that refers to, temper? We think of it as a psychological state, but it actually means they've gone out of tune. So we talk about equal temperament on a piano, for instance. It has to do with being in tune. So to lose your temper literally means to go out of tune. It's a form of disorder. And there's a likeness between something that's out of tune musically and a person whose disposition is out of tune to the point where they've lost control in some way. They're out of tune with reality in somewhere. Lewis in Abolition of Man has a wonderful phrase where he talks about for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. There's a shape to reality that we need to conform ourselves. And the analogy of music, or the mystery of music as a mode of recognizing that order, still survives in our language to some extent. I'm going to cite some quotes from Calvin Stapert's book, A New Song for an Old World, in which he discusses the beliefs of many of the church fathers. He talks quite a bit about Clement of Alexandria, who believed that, as Stapert summarizes it, one's music is not merely a reflection of the kind of person one is. It is, to a certain extent, involved in shaping a person. Again, we tend to think that we're the sovereign, we're in charge, and our music is music because we chose it. But what if that music is the music that has shaped us so that we resonate with it because it has shaped us in some way? And what if it's shaped us in some bad ways? Clement, continuing Stapert, I'll try not to interfere with him so much. Clement and the church fathers were in general agreement on this point, and they were united with Plato and most of the thinkers of antiquity. And then Stapert goes on and says, for that matter, they are united with most people at all times and in all places. Ancient and modern, East and West, primitive and literate, sophisticated and unsophisticated, civilized and uncivilized. Of course, there have always been skeptics too, but the biggest concentration of skeptics, that is, skeptics about this idea of music, both that it displays the order of creation in some way, and that it has a powerful effect in shaping us, in rendering us out of tune with reality or in tune with reality in some way. The biggest concentration of skeptics on this appears to be modern Western civilization. Anywhere else in human history, you would find agreement on this. Now, I'm not always one for identifying with the majority, but it's a remarkable observation, given all of the other things concerning which modern Western civilization is skeptical. I want to get people to ask themselves, which side would they rather be on, really? Which side do they feel more comfortable with, and why? At least since the time of Pythagoras, who is 6th century BC, the connections between music and mathematics were a source of marveling. Sound, as you know, is produced by vibration, things that vibrate, and everything vibrates at some frequency or another, and the frequency can change based on how the vibration is produced. And low sounds, what we call low sounds, and here I'm using a metaphor, and I want to call attention right now, and I want you to remember that we use spatial metaphors all the time in talking about music. Low sounds, why would that be low? It's not in space. Versus high sounds. Low sounds are produced by slower frequencies, a lower rate of vibration, and high sounds come from a faster rate of vibration. And it turns out that pleasant sounds, when we hear 2 or 3 sounds together, it turns out that there's a mathematical explanation for that experience of pleasantness. And it's tied to the ratio of the frequency of vibrations of one thing to the frequency of vibrations of another thing. And I'll explain more of this in my last lecture today. So without getting into those details, the relationship between music and mathematics led to theories about the relationship of music to cosmic order. If the universe was a good place, it would somehow exhibit harmony, and music was regarded as a case in point of harmoniousness, but not the only case in point of harmony. Early Christian writers picked up on this idea, arguing that Christ, who is described in Colossians 1 as the source of all being and coherence, was the new song that retuned the world. That's a metaphor that shows up over and over. A concern about music that emerges in Plato and which is amplified in the church fathers is that music can disorder our lives by disordering our loves. Certain forms of music can excite the passions and interfere with the deliberateness of moral life. Now, by speaking of the passions, as soon as you cite that, people say, oh, well, they didn't want music to be emotional. But that's not what was at stake at all. By passions, they weren't referring to just emotions per se. They were referring to unruly emotions. Robert Louis Wilkin, church historian, says they are unruly emotions like fear, anger, jealousy, and passionate love. Another church historian, Peter Brown, in his book The Body and Society, explains that both classical and patristic concern about overwrought passions was because, quote, the passions colored perceptions of the outside world with non-existent sources of fear, anxiety, and hope. Now this is very interesting. Unpack Brown. Passions can make us too fearful, they can make us anxious, but they can also make us more hopeful than we ought to be about particular things. Or else they bathed it in a false glow of pleasure and potential satisfaction. And of course we have music that does that for us. That we call it muzak, I think. There's music that we use to bathe ourselves in a false glow of satisfaction, and then if we hear it in a store, we're incited to buy something. The passions, Brown adds, were not what we tend to call feelings, rather they were complexes that hindered the true expression of feelings. There's big literature on the idea of sentimentality. Sentimentality is a problem not just because it's emotional, but sentimentality is unwarranted emotion about something. There is, I'm told, a Precious Moments Sistine Chapel that we can visit and delight in the image of God with, I don't know, big eyes, I guess, creating an Adam with a big fat face. And this is sentimentality, and I would argue that it distorts our perception and actually prevents us from having a true expression of feelings. Church historian Roberta Bondi, in a book called To Love as God Loves, defines passions as emotions, attitudes, desires, and ways of acting that blind us in our dealings with ourselves, with each other, and the world, and so pervert perfectly good and useful impulses which take away our freedom to love. And Clement of Alexandria himself, and Clement's dates are 150 to 215 roughly, defined passion as an excessive appetite exceeding the measures of reason, or appetite unbridled and disobedient to the word. Passions, then, Clement goes on, are a perturbation of the soul contrary to nature in disobedience to reason. They're feelings that are out of tune. They're untempered. Music that excited the passions was to be avoided because that music encouraged unnatural preoccupations that fought against the proper pursuit of a virtuous life. And the theologians and pastors of the early church were unanimous in condemning such music. Calvin Stapert writes, "The early Christian writers aimed no polemic at the nobler art music or folk music of their day. Had they been opposed to it, they would no doubt have spoken against it. Their denunciations of music were not general. Rather, they were aimed at a few well-defined targets: the music of popular public spectacles, the music associated with voluptuous banqueting, the music associated with pagan weddings, and the music of pagan religious rites and festivities." And he goes on, as we have already seen in the book, they were not alone in their denunciations. They joined the voices of those pagan Romans who were painfully aware of the decay of their own civilization. Stapert points out that there were even barbarians who were appalled when they came in contact with Roman culture and saw the decadence that was expressed in music and theater in Roman culture. And so I think when contemporary critics condemn certain cultural practices as barbaric, they may be giving barbarism a bad name. In some instances, the barbarians knew better. Even barbarians had standards of what was natural and what was unnatural, what was fitting and what was unfitting. Now it's notable the patristics didn't condemn this licentious, passionate music just as unchristian or as unbiblical, but as unnatural. It's not fitting for the kind of thing music was, but more significantly, not fitting for the kind of beings that we are. Now, in the early 6th century, Roman philosopher Boethius named 3 classes of music that explained the relationship of the soul to the cosmos through sound. And they, as a Roman philosopher, used Latin terms to designate these 3 classes of music. And I'm sorry I just realized I should have created a slide with these 3 terms, but they're not complicated. Musica mundana, M-U-N-D-A-N-A. Musica mundana refers to the order and harmony of the universe. Calvin Stapert points out that a vestige of this idea remains in the hymn, "This is my Father's world," when we sing, "And round me rings the music of the spheres." Musica mundana, our harmony of the universe, which was not audible harmony necessarily, It was harmony in the more abstract sense, in a sense like the harmony that St. Paul enjoins believers to have among one another. Secondly, musica humana refers to the order and harmony among human beings. In this sense, a musical person is not what we mean by that phrase today. They would refer to someone as musical, not a person with great performing skills or fine voice or keen ear. Rather, it means a well-balanced or virtuous person. Cassiodorus, who was born around 485, says, "If we live virtuously, we are constantly under music's discipline. But when we commit injustice, we are without music." To be without music is, again, to have lost your temper, to be out of tune. Then this is a metaphor that shows up over and over. Now, for Boethius, the third class, musica instrumentalis, and you should be able to spell that. Just add an is to the word instrumental. Musica instrumentalis, the third class of music, simply refers to what we today would call music, ordered sounds produced by human voices and instruments. And as Stapert points out, ideally, musica instrumentalis should be a reflection of musica mundana. That is, it should be an audible manifestation of the order and harmony of the universe if it's to fulfill the function of helping to tune our out-of-tune souls. Now, near the end of his discussion of this, Calvin Stapert argues that we really need to ask why the church, for most of its history, was sympathetic to this kernel of truth in Plato's theory, and why the modern church has forgotten or abandoned it. And here's Stapert's question, or assertion, I should say. The Platonic idea of musica mundana, which was Christianized in the early Christian era and remained in wide currency until the Enlightenment, deserves to remain in our image of the new song that Christ is and brings to us, because it expresses a basic truth most beautifully. God is a God of order and harmony. It speaks to our imaginations of the Creator as an artist, the Creator who made the universe not only useful and mechanically efficient. And here this gets to our idea of God as intelligent designer. We think of God as the great engineer. But what if God's intelligent, beautiful design is the design of a composer, a brilliant composer? A Creator who made the universe not only useful and mechanically efficient, but who also made it beautiful. At each word from the Creator, order emerged from chaos, and it was good. A kind of goodness that was not limited to, but certainly included, beauty. God doesn't say it is optimal of his creation, like an engineer might. He says it is good. And we, again, as modern people, we tend to read that in terms of efficiency or in terms of a moral goodness. But what if the goodness that's present there is actually better understood as something like beauty? Stapert, here in his discussion, refers to the work of David Bentley Hart, Orthodox theologian, who in this book, The Beauty of the Infinite, writes that according to Gregory of Nyssa, creation is a wonderfully wrought hymn to the power of the Almighty. The order of the universe is a kind of musical harmony, richly and multifariously toned, guided by an inward rhythm and accord, pervaded by an essential symphony. That's the word that Gregory used. The melody and cadence of the cosmic elements in their intermingling sing of God's glory, as does the interrelation of motion and rest within created things. And in this sympathy of all things, one with the other, music in its truest and most perfect form is bodied forth. Elsewhere in his book, his extremely complicated book, Hart displays a sympathy with Gregory's view, as God is Trinity, in whom all difference is possessed as perfect peace and unity. The divine life might be described as infinite music. And creation, too, might be described as music whose intervals, transitions, and phrases are embraced within God's eternal triune polyphony. Polyphony, multi-voiced music where the voices intertwine and reinforce and support one another, and the sum of the total is greater. The total is greater than the sum of the parts. Hart believes that there are abundant biblical reasons, quite apart from the influences of pagan philosophy. And here he's basically saying people get nervous because Pagans are the first ones to have asserted this. Well, there are abundant biblical reasons for Christians to speak of harmonia mundi, or musica mundana. In Scripture, creation rejoices in God, proclaims his glory, sings before him. The pleasing conceits of pagan cosmology aside, theology has all the warrant it needs for speaking of creation as a divine composition, a magnificent music whose measures and refrains rise up to the pleasure and the glory of God. Now, in our age, we prefer idioms, we prefer metaphors that are mechanical to those that are artistic or even organic. So we don't have a problem thinking of the universe as a big machine. We don't even have a problem sometimes of thinking of our bodies as machines, thinking of ourselves as machines, or thinking of social interactions as machines. A network, okay? They talk about social networking. So we're just nodes in this mechanism of some sort. Part of what I want to try to do is say that the metaphors, we live and die by our metaphors. The metaphors we use to describe things can either be accurate and appropriate metaphors, or they can be careless metaphors. And the musical metaphor is one we've lost, and I think that that has affected our actual creation of music and our participation in music. Calvin Stapert is eager that we, quote, not let our cultural conditioning cause us to reject out of hand the idea that, as Clement put it, the new song composed the universe into melodious order and tuned the discord of the elements to harmonious arrangement so that the whole world might become harmony. That's Clement. It makes a difference whether we think of the universe as a symphony or a machine. And I'm suggesting that the shift in our cosmic imagery from musica mundana to machina mundana does not deepen our understanding either of the cosmos or the machine. The idea that there's some sort of analogous relationship between our experience of music and the life of the whole creation is really a powerful one, and we can approach the idea in two ways. One of two ways. We can either say our experience of music is just a metaphor, a kind of object lesson to help explain something about the universe, or we can take what I think is a more mind-bending approach and say that our experience of music, even the most magnificent, harmonious, melodious, complete music, is just a faint echo of the deeper reality that's present in creation because it's present in God. Our experience of harmony is hearing through a loudspeaker faintly, if I can paraphrase St. Paul, seeing through a glass darkly. We're hearing through a loudspeaker faintly harmonic reality that is at the heart of things. The greatest achievements of musical art are testimonies not only to the reality of creation, but to something of God's own beauty, which is simply to say that the beauty we perceive in our senses is like the beauty that is in God. And music has the capacity for a particular kind of beauty. I find it interesting that there are many more references to the idea that a piece of music displays mysteries of the transcendent than there are that a painting or a piece of sculpture can do so. One occasionally finds people describing a kind of ecstasy with regard to a visual object, but it's much more common with regard to music. I think it's partly because of the fact that music enters into us in some way. We participate in music in ways we do not participate in a work of visual art. And we don't have time to look at the difference of this, how our sensory perception of images and our sensory perception of sounds really orient us quite differently. I think there's a reason why hearing is the preferred mode of responding to God in the scriptures rather than seeing. When people do talk about that revelatory power of music, they usually refer to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. That's kind of like 9 out of 10 will refer to Bach for some reason. And in The Beauty of the Infinite, Hart argues that Bach is the greatest of Christian theologians. Just bluntly says, no qualification. He's the most inspired witness to the ordered love in the fabric of creation. And Hart starts this by saying that in Christian eschatology, we are promised, quote, only more and greater harmony, whose developments, embellishments, and movement never end. The analogy between God and Bach's handiworks is audible chiefly in Bach's limitless capacity to develop separate lines of music, separate lines of melody, or even harmonic lines, into extraordinary intricacies of contrapuntal complication. Contrapuntal, meaning that the sounds are interacting with each other. in a complicated way. And he does this without ever sacrificing an essential sense of peace and accord by which the music is governed. The glimpse into eternity that Hart sees, and as Douglas Adams, the late Douglas Adams, the poor agnostic, saw, that's been noted by many, many other listeners, and even, as in the case of Adams, quite a few who don't believe in eternity but wish they could. And it's because the portrayal of glory that Bach achieves through musical form is so compelling. Of late, I've been saying if I were the devil, I'd get rid of Bach. If I wanted to render implausible the reality of the glory of God, I'd distract as many people as possible away from the richest expressions of beauty. But I'm afraid that our conventional musical practices make it less and less likely that Bach will be discovered. Now, Bach was a devout Lutheran. I recently ran across a passage from Luther that mentions this characteristic of counterpoint or contrapuntal music or polyphony as a distinct expression of beauty. We tend to associate Luther with kind of rough and ready chorales, but Luther was actually a huge fan of some of the most complex, nuanced, and subtle music of his day. The principal practitioners of polyphony in Luther's day were composers living in the lowlands, most notably Franco-Flemish composer Josquin des Prez, who died in 1521. Oh, I already had him up there, sorry. And I've read some historians who say that Josquin was Luther's favorite composer. Here's a passage in which Luther certainly expresses very little patience for people who aren't responsive to music like that of Josquin's. And last night I was looking for a piece of Josquin that we might listen to, but we just need more time. So that's homework. Here's Luther. Finally, however, when the attempt is made to improve one's natural ability, here he's saying it's a good thing to cultivate musical capacity, and Luther was a big believer in that. When the attempt is made to improve one's natural ability, to develop and unfold it completely, we can perceive, astonished, but cannot comprehend the boundless and perfect wisdom of God revealed in his wonderful gift of music. Outstanding in this art is this. That is the most remarkable thing about the capacity of music is this fact. That while one voice continues to sing its cantus firmus, and how would you translate what would be a good cantus firmus would be? It's the chant, okay, the regular chant. Okay, so the melody that we all know and love, it was part of the regular liturgical life of the church. While one voice continues to sing its cantus firmus, other voices at the same time cavort about the principal voice in the most wonderful manner with praise and jubilation, adorning the cantus firmus with most lovely movement. They seem to present a kind of divine dance, so that even those of our day who have only a most limited amount of sentiment and emotion gain the impression that there exists nothing more wonderful and beautiful, like that cabbie who saw the wonder and beauty and actually wished he'd been a better person. Those who are not moved by this are indeed unmusical and deserve to hear some dunghill poet or the music of swine. Come on, Martin, tell us what you really think. All right? Now, following my model of theme and variations, I want to share some poetry with you in which this high view of music survived, at least into the 17th, 16th century, and it actually shows up quite a bit later, and even into the 20th century shows up in some poets. A view in which music is tied to cosmic order and God's work of creation and to the shaping of our inner life, of our affections. And I want to start with a work by John Milton, and this actually spread out through 3 slides so we could print it big enough so you could see it. At a solemn music, and scholars think that this may have been Milton's response to having heard a particular piece of sacred music in a church. And we'll read through it and then I'll unpack it a little bit for you. Blessed pair of sirens, pledges of heaven's joy, sphere-born harmonious sisters, voice and verse, wed your divine sounds, and mixed power employ dead things with inbreathed sense, able to pierce and to our high-raised fantasy present that undisturbed song of pure consent. I sung before the sapphire-colored throne to him that sits thereon, with saintly shout and solemn jubilee, where the bright seraphim in burning row their loud uplifted angel trumpets blow, and the cherubic host in thousand choirs touch their immortal harps of golden wires. With those just spirits that wear victorious palms, hymns devout and holy psalms, singing everlastingly, that we on earth with undiscording voice may rightly answer that melodious noise, as once we did, till disproportioned sin jarred against nature's chime, and with harsh din broke the fair music that all creatures make to their great Lord, whose love their motion swayed in perfect diapason, whilst they stood in first obedience and their state of good. Oh, may we soon again renew that song and keep in tune with heaven, till God ere long to his celestial consort us unite, to live with him and sing in endless morn of light. Now, I can't possibly do justice to this in a short amount of time. Let me unpack a little bit here. The celestial spheres referred to here, the sirens in mythology were the ones who produced the music of the spheres. You may remember something if you saw, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" There were sirens there as well. Voice and verse is probably a voice referring probably to the music of the spheres itself, that is creation's natural music, musica mundana. And verse is the song of the angelic choir, which symbolizes heavenly order. Let's see, did we get to? Yeah, fantasy. Really just another word for imagination. Of course, we have a reference here to the sapphire-colored throne, which is a reference to Ezekiel 1. And do we have melodious noise on this? I didn't mark down. No, the melodious noise shows up on the next one. And this is really the music of the angelic choir. Now, this... it's interesting how he talks about our sin as falling out of tune also. He uses the musical metaphor. Our disproportioned sin is talking here about the fall, that we broke the harmony of the natural order, jarred against nature's chimes. And perfect diapason. Diapason can sometimes refer to the notes of an octave. It sometimes refers to a register in organs. One scholar says diapason here represents the harmony between heaven and earth, like the harmony in an octave. That is where they sound the same note, just an octave apart. And by first obedience here, he's referring to our situation before sin. One of the neatest little aspects of this is the way he used the word consort here. To his celestial consort, us unite. Because consort can mean a group of musicians. That's how we usually use it. In this case, angels. But it also can mean a marriage partner. And it can also mean musical harmony itself. So he's using a three-step pun, or a three-phase pun here, that we're going to be united to celestial consort. The church will be united to its husband in Christ, but we'll be united to harmony as well. Another poem, one that I know better because I've heard it sung frequently, by John Dryden, a song for St. Cecilia Day. St. Cecilia was the patron saint of music. And it was common in England, at least in the 17th century, and I think earlier, for poets to write songs or poems dedicated to St. Cecilia that dealt with music. I'm just going to reproduce a part of this. Handel set this to music, and it's a brilliant setting. It's about 30 minutes long, the whole poem. From heavenly harmony, this universal frame began. Here he's referring to the universal frame is the universe, the structure of things. When nature underneath a heap of jarring atoms lay, suggesting a kind of chaos, primordial chaos, and could not heave her head, the tuneful voice was heard from high, "Arise, ye more than dead." This is God's word of creation. "Then cold and hot and moist and dry, in order to their stations leap, and music's power obey." He's suggesting that this is actually sung, a tuneful voice. God's speaking creation into existence is a singing of creation into existence. From harmony, from heavenly harmony, this universal frame began, from harmony to harmony. This is actually later in the poem. This is actually the last stanza where he repeats from harmony, from heavenly harmony. This universal frame began from harmony to harmony. Through all the compass of the notes it ran, the diapason closing full in man. So the music achieves its climax in the creation of man, as from the power of sacred lays, that is, divine song creates the spheres, as from the power of the original divine music, the spheres began to move and sung the great Creator's praise to all the blessed above. So when the last and dreadful hour this crumbling pageant shall devour, the trumpet shall be heard on high, the dead shall live, the living die, and music shall untune the sky. Well, we do know that there will be a trumpet that sounds, so there is a kind of music that occurs, but this image of untuning the sky, I'm not quite sure exactly. Something's going to be unmade so that something else can be made in the new heavens and the new earth. Now finally, from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and I chose this partly because there's a wonderful setting of this by Ralph Vaughan Williams that he wrote for one of the proms concerts in the 1930s. Proms concerts are huge kind of national patriotic musical events in England, unprecedented by anything here. The Super Bowl possibly is like it. I'm sorry I said that. It's patriotic and cultural and exciting, but in England it involves Edward Elgar and Ralph Vaughan Williams and lots of really good music. Vaughan Williams took this portion of The Merchant of Venice, which is Act 5 scene, I can't remember which scene it is, sorry about that. Peter probably knows. Which again is a meditation, a conversation about music. How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Here will we sit and let the sounds of music, and there's actually an ensemble of musicians playing in the house up above the hill at this point. And let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness and the night become the touches of sweet harmony. Become, I think, meaning are fitting for or are in harmony with, not that they transformed. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not a smallest orb that thou beholdst, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. This is the morning stars are still singing, he's suggesting. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. So he's saying that there's something in us that resonates with that order in creation, but our sinfulness, and here I'm sorry to say that muddy vesture of decay suggests that while we still have physical bodies, we cannot hear it. I don't think it's the fact that we don't have bodies, I think it's the fact that we're sinful. Then come ho and wake Diana with a hymn. He's apparently addressing his musicians here, and Diana here is used to represent the moon. Let's keep the night going. With sweetest touches, pierce your mistress's ear and draw her home with music. And then Jessica says, I'm never merry when I hear sweet music. And Lorenzo explains, the reason is your spirits are attentive. The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. Someone who's out of tune is a dangerous public fellow. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Music, hark, and here again he's calling to the musicians to make music. Act 5, Scene 1. Again, a wonderful expression that survives in Shakespeare. I'm sure a lot of people read this and have no idea what Shakespeare's talking about because they have no idea of this notion of these different layers of music. We're going to stop there. The next talk, we're going to take some questions, and then the next talk will be, and we'll take, can we take 7 minutes of questions? I ran a little later than, yeah. And then we'll, in the next talk, look at some specific questions about the nature of musical form. Okay. You don't have to chant it, though.
I won't do that. First question is, how does your appeal to the objectivity of musical standards escape the modernist false dichotomy of subject and object?
How does it escape it?
Yes. I guess assuming that you want to, that's the question.
Yeah, I want to escape it. Is practically speaking or theoretically? That is, how do I get around the modernist?
Escape is the word used.
Well, I want to appeal to a kind of objectivity, and so I want to appeal to. I want to appeal to, again, a givenness in the order of things, which is not necessarily the same thing that modernist objectivity is about, and I don't want to separate. I don't want to separate the two. So I want to talk just not about, modernists will talk about objective truth, and I want to talk about objective reality or real reality, to paraphrase Francis Schaeffer used to always talk about true truth. I want to talk about real reality, and that reality has a shape to it, and that the shape is not just a shape that is merely mathematical, but the shape is indeed moral. That there's a fittingness to, for instance, our standards of sexual ethics, because there's something actually in the nature of embodiment and procreation and other things that make it fitting. So I would say, yeah, okay. I would say I don't want objectivity in that modernist sense. But a lot of people say, well, the postmodern rejection of modernist objectivity is simply an embrace of pure relativism. And no, there's a pre-modern understanding of objectivity that I want to try to recover, and part of what I want to do is to recognize, and I'm just joining smarter people than myself in trying to advance this project, of recognizing that there's a way of understanding of objectivity that avoids the split that modernism imposes on us.
Can there be excellence and glory in low culture? Can one have high standards in pop music?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to allude today to a work that has an extended chapter on the decline of popular song in 20th century America, that compares Irving Berlin and George Gershwin and a number of other, Harold Arlen, and the music that's written in popular music today. And so I will address that a little bit. And so, yeah, there are still standards of excellence and possibility for communication and meaning in popular forms. This is not something, and I think that's a big mistake, to assume that we only have to apply standards in concert hall music and not in stuff we listen to every day, which is a little bit like saying we should only have nutritional standards when we have a feast, but not worry about it in everyday meals. I mean, there are ways to imbue every meal with something of the goodness, a recognition of the goodness that food is, without it having to be a elegant feast.
Do you have any thoughts regarding Hermann Hesse's glass bead game?
I have absolutely none. I'm ashamed to say, but I probably should.
Any thoughts concerning Hermann Hesse in general?
Not really. Not enough to articulate in public. So.
Is it biblical to subordinate emotion to reason, or should both be equally ultimate in our aesthetic lives?
I think that, yeah. I think it's. I will address this a little bit when in one of these talks coming up. I can't remember which one. I do talk about St. Paul in Corinthians, saying, "I will sing I will sing with my spirit, but I will sing with my understanding also. I don't think that, I don't want to elevate one over the other. I want to say that, in a sense, reason enables us to love what we should love. But love also orders our reasoning. So I think there's a mutual reinforcement of the two. And I'm not sure, I don't think that, I think God wants us to love him, not just be good theologians of love. Just like he doesn't say to Adam and Eve, behold, I've given you a garden to develop a theology of gardening. He says, you're going to garden. so.
Okay. Another, was it the use or the content of the music that made the early church fathers condemn Roman music? Was it the musical qualities themselves? What in particular were the qualities they were condemning?
It was both. I mean, it was not just the words, for sure. And it was the musical qualities themselves. And this is something I'll get into the next lecture, look at how musical qualities move us in a particular direction. But if I can give a quick example of the musical forms are usually chosen, if they're chosen well, even if they're chosen well toward bad ends, they're chosen because of certain aspects that they resonate with, and this will be clear in the next lecture. They resonate really well with the end. So if you're trying to promote licentiousness, there are some forms of music that are better at promoting licentiousness than others. And I'm sure we could go to the dorms at the university and find that if someone wants to promote licentiousness in a dorm room or at a party, that, I don't know, a Mozart string quartet is unlikely to show up on the playlist. Gregorian chant, possibly in some perverse way. But, but I think that, sorry, I get carried away sometimes. I have too much imagination. And in fact, I've thought of doing a study at the University of Virginia. I hope to pull this off this year and go and ask students, if you're trying to promote a particular feeling, and I'm going to list, if you want to study hard or if you want to promote excitement or you're trying to make it somehow, what kind of music would you choose? And I'm sure that there's not a random distribution of musical options. And so in the classical world, there were forms of music that were associated with some of these licentious feasts or the pagan weddings, in which they were often the texts of the songs that were sung were pretty vulgar. And some of the church fathers saw that Christians were using the same vulgar music, and not just vulgar in the sense that it was earthy, but actually obscene in some way, at Christian weddings, because they didn't have a repertoire. They didn't have a repertoire of music that was appropriate for weddings that could be celebratory without descending into something else. So it was the Gestalt. It was the Gesamtkunstwerk, to use Wagner's term. It was the whole package of instrumentation and instrumental qualities and modalities of the sound there's, again, rap music or hip hop is another interesting example. It's motivated by a kind of resentment and a certain kind of assertiveness. I mean, humble hip hop is a phrase that we don't usually think of. And it is a musical form that's very well suited to a kind of strutting confidence. Most music does make us want to dance in a particular way, as my daughter once informed me. And the way our bodies move in space, or the way we position our bodies in space, are often expressions of some inner reality. So we bow our heads in certain instances, we hold our heads up high in certain instances, and there's some music which encourages us to hold our heads up high, and there's some music that encourages us to bow our heads. So music often informs the inner life by informing the body and the relationship, and it's not an entirely arbitrary relationship between posture, bodily posture, the form of the body, and the form of the soul.